Welcome to my YouTube channel. This segment is the podcast. I'm calling this right now the PowerChair podcast. Yeah, and I think I'm going to keep that name. Maybe it'll change. I don't know, man. That's the great thing about starting a YouTube channel. Nobody's freaking watching anyway. Here, let me use my very fancy studio and put some more light on me. What? Look at that. It's a lamp. The chair that you see me sitting in for the podcast was my grandfather's chair. And, I knew my grandfather, but can't say I knew him intimately, right? Like, I didn't know everything about him. But I do know that my grandfather had a very difficult life, and he sacrificed a lot in his life. And I also know that he came from a time of very, how do I say this? Harsh opinions. Came from a time of harsh opinions. I think that's a fair way of saying it. I don't think that excuses any individual's beliefs or attitudes. However, it is important to understand there was a different context. And for a long time, I used to be quite angry at my grandfather for some of these harsh opinions. But I also realize now, after he's gone, and I wish I would have had this wisdom while he was still alive, that it said more about me and my harshness towards his harsh opinions than his harsh opinions themselves, because I just didn't listen to him and hear him out. And I wish I would have done that a little bit more and just extended in more compassion. Like, every time I look at this chair now and the intention behind bringing this chair into this podcast, it's just this. I think right now in our society, we put so much emphasis and pressure on people to not only have opinions, but perfect opinions. And if you point to me, a perfect person, I will point to you that you're wrong. I'm sorry. And that includes me. And my intention with this podcast is to open up a space where we get to explore ideas, and I may be wrong on a bunch of things I'm saying, or somebody else may be wrong if I'm privileged enough to have somebody come on and chat with me. But I think the intention is just that, trying desperately to be better people. And that may come up in all kinds of different ways. But I think it's really important to bring a little grace into the not political, this is not a political podcast, rather common discourse. So that's the intention behind the chair, is just an open depiction of being imperfect and also the beauty of imperfection. I think my grandfather was a really great man. He did a lot of really great things. He had some opinions I disagreed with, fine, but I also don't really know the nuance of his opinions because I never really listened, and that's something that I wish I would have done better. So this podcast is my intention of being a better listener. Although I'll be maybe talking about myself or maybe sharing personal experience, especially going on a rant like this podcast is, the intention is to contribute, to offer, and to see humanity in the beauty of it as much as possible. So, enjoy. All right, hello, beautiful humans. I'd like to welcome you to the very first podcast. Today it's just me, Brad. I think it's probably going to be me going on rants, I suspect, which is perfectly fine, and quite frankly, I'm so wonderfully unpopular at the moment, so it doesn't have to be polished. Yeah, I'm not really sure what to call this podcast kind of template forum, so I'm not really sure what to call it yet. That'll come, and it's okay if it's, yeah, no, I'm just gonna start. The idea behind it and the topics that you can kind of expect if you decide to connect with this sort of content, if this is what you're looking for. I am all about trying to be the best person you can be. That's a unique journey for everyone. That being said, I think there are some universals, and everyone needs some encouragement along that path. It's a very lonely path. It's a very difficult path. And I just want to be a place for people to,
click on when you are struggling and need a little extra gas in the tank, as we all do. And selfishly, this also provides me that as well. One of the things I want to talk about today is attachment. But specifically what I want to talk about is the relationship to desire. Now, I'm tempted to just like dive in and just talk about these things, but I also like don't know how much background I should be giving you about me. And just honor my own boundaries. What I will say is this: I'm not an expert, I'm not a psychologist. Training to be one, but I'm a very, very long ways away from having that certification. So everything I am saying in this video, take a grain with salt and consult your own mental health team and professionals. So those disclaimers aside, one of the things I'd like to talk to you about is in my journey, and I think this is a pretty common experience, is I would ask you to consider your relationship to desire. And what I mean by that specifically is that if you encounter an object of desire, so whether that's a person you're attracted to that you haven't met yet and you're nervous about approaching this person, or if it's a job or a career or an interview or whatever this thing or person or group or whatever this thing is that you desire, when the feeling of desire emerges, what are the emotions that kind of come up typically for you? I think this is an important question to ask. I think it connects nicely to attachment. I think for a lot of people, but for me specifically, the first feeling that would come up is insecurity or an overall feeling of inadequacy and insufficiency. Because I think fundamentally, you cannot desire something that you have, right? You only desire something you don't have. Desire inherently is tied to a lack, right? And so for me, I wouldn't so much experience the desire in the sense of an opportunity to cultivate or build something, but I would look at it as a representation of that in which I don't have, that I lack, right? And that usually was tied to like a deep loneliness. I think a lot of people relate to that, unfortunately. And so for me, the emotions would kind of cycle. And so it would come first, it would be a feeling of inadequacy, loneliness, sadness. And that's kind of the key emotion there, is sadness. Because underneath all those layers of inadequacy, that really is the fundamental feeling, is isolation. And you could almost think of sadness as evidence that you value connection and you've lost the connection or are lacking the connection. And immediately after that feeling, the next emotion that would come up for me would be anger, right? It's not my fault. It's not necessarily, maybe it is that. You could be mad at all women or mad at all men or mad at people in general, or this isn't fair for whatever reason it is, whatever the flavor is for you. I mean, everybody's got their own demons and things, but for me, it would constantly be cycling through this, where I would kind of create these enemies. And what that afforded me is two things. One is it solidified a sense of identity, and an identity in the context of virtue. Because if I'm against person X or concept X or whatever it is, if I'm against something, that provides contrast for me to understand who I am myself. And it also allows me to believe that I am a good person, because I am so clearly against this awful, terrible thing, which makes me a good person. So I'm able to gain a sense of identity, So that's a benefit. And then on top of that, it alleviates the pain and distress of being inadequate, right? Because I'm not inadequate. These are just terrible people, right? So it alleviates that feeling as well. So it alleviates the sadness, which obviously is a temporary strategy that is wildly ineffective. But it also has a lot of costs too, that anger, because that anger is a defensive strategy, a psychological defensive strategy, and it can lead to impulsivity, and it can lead to saying things you don't necessarily mean or that you will regret later. And it's also just exhausting. If you're constantly oscillating, like if you're constantly oscillating between sadness and anger, and you feel these emotions immediately when you are on the cusp of achieving something that you desire, and you're working really hard on yourself, and you're trying to grow and to expand, you're going to be hitting these points of things you desire a lot, which means most of your time you're going to be angry or sad. If this relates to you, and I hope it doesn't, but it definitely related to me. And for me, I think that this relationship of this feeling of inadequacy, and then the psychological defense for that feeling, and then recognizing that as a psychological defense, and that it's not entirely true, that people aren't terrible and all these things, and then feeling sad again because they didn't choose you, and all of a sudden it's kind of like this. It's like you're looking at people in this sense. You're looking up or you're looking down, right? So it's like if I'm angry, it's like looking down. If I'm looking up, I feel inadequate. But to look eye to eye indicates to me that there's an attachment issue that I am healing. And what's interesting is I think one of the biggest problems in having this conversation about attachment is that people will try to classify their attachment styles. And there's nothing wrong with that classification, but there is something wrong with the absolute nature of the classification. And here's what I mean. I think is that true? Yeah, I think it is true. Attachment isn't a psychological diagnosis. There's avoidant personality disorder, but there isn't avoidant attachment style as a pathology, right? Obviously, there are attachment-based pathologies in psychology, but attachment itself isn't a pathology, so that's important. And please dive into that and let me know in the comments if I'm wrong on that, because I'm almost certain I'm right about that. But even in these personality disorders and other pathologies in the DSM, I'm not entirely convinced that these diagnoses, and I'm including things like mental illnesses, right, the more biologically based problems like bipolar and schizophrenia and these types of challenges, I'm not entirely convinced that these diagnoses are designed to tell people what is wrong as much as they are designed to provide a roadmap on how to get better. That's a really important distinction. And the thing I think anybody will note if they've been on a mental health journey is it's quite common for people to receive multiple diagnoses and multiple labels. And the reason is simply that nobody fits neatly into a box. And sometimes a lot of different labels are there to help the mental health team figure out what flavor they're dealing with to help make a treatment plan that's tailored and effective for that person. So there's an issue with these labels, especially with our attachment to these things. That's all a lot of talk to basically say nothing. Working on it. But here's the crux of what I'm saying. I'm not entirely convinced there's a person, even on the insecure attachment styles, that's purely anxious or purely avoidant or purely fearful. I don't think there are people that fit these categories solely. Maybe there are, but I would imagine they're the outliers. I think what you're going to typically see from people is the oscillation of these attachment injuries in different stages of the relationship. So I kind of give you a classical example of something that I have seen from a lot of guys, and I've seen from a lot of women. And that's kind of the only thing that I can really speak on, and I'm just curious what you guys think. A lot of guys tend to be extraordinarily anxious in their attachment style at the emergence of a relationship. And I am speaking about a heteronormative dynamic, and I understand that. I know there's lots of different connections, but I can only really talk about things that I can relate to. So I don't mean to exclude anyone, but I just have to use examples, right? Can't talk about everybody. But the kind of typical way you'll see is this anxiousness in the initial interaction, which isn't always the case. There's definitely a lot of men that are avoidant on the get-go. But I think in aggregate, you see a lot of men that are extremely anxious in the attachment. Is this girl really interested in me? Does she really like me? I don't really know what she wants. I'm very confused. There's this almost like desire to have this woman and this anxiety of her leaving, because a woman being interested in you is a demonstration of your own worth. That's not, I think, a healthy way of viewing connection, but I do think there is a attachment injury there, that I have to convince someone to want me. And if they don't want me, something's wrong with me, right? But then what's really interesting is if a relationship merges, what you tend to see a lot of times is that, and I think this goes from a structure of a childhood with, let's say, an overbearing mother or a female in this person's life that was maybe too involved, let's say. There's a feeling of suffocation that happens. So it's like very, very anxious, need you close to me. Then all of a sudden we build a relationship, and now all of a sudden I feel suffocated, you're too close, push away. So you have anxious attachment style in the bonding stage of the relationship. Once the bond is formed, then you have an avoidant attachment. So it makes sense that when you think about the context of the attachment injury and how it was formed through childhood, it makes sense that through different stages of a relationship, there will be different manifestations of attachment injury, right? Or insecure attachment. There may be avoidant stages, there may be insecure stages. And to label yourself as, oh, I have anxious attachment the entire way through the relationship, that may be true. But the reason I'm giving you this example, and I'll give you another example too, and this is typically what I see with women quite substantially, is that, you know, and there's some temperament to this as well, but when I say temperament, I'm talking about like hypergamy and different, women tend to be very, very choosy, and I think that's a great thing, they should be. But there's a difference, and here's what I mean by that. You can see women be very avoidant in their initial interactions, right? Like they'll be pushing a person that they're interested in, they'll be pushing them away, and that can be for various reasons. Kind of the classical example is a fear of abandonment or a fear of building a bond with someone and it not being safe and that person leaves. And because there's this anxiety of being dropped and hurt when you're really, really trusting someone, really close to someone, forming that initial connection is a really anxiety-provoking thing, and this is avoidant attachment at the onset of the relationship. So as a relationship's emerging, there's a lot of distance, there's a lot of fear, there's a lot of anxiety of pushing this person away, and then as soon as the relationship bond is established, then anxious attachment clicks in, and now it's like ride or die, and I want to be with this person all the time. And you can see how these two classical examples tend to fit each other perfectly in a really horrible way. Everyone's miserable the entire course of the relationship, and I sincerely hope that nobody relates to that, but I also know the reality that probably a lot of people do. But I think the important thing about this example and why I'm laying this out is it's important to understand what these categories mean, what anxious attachment and avoidant attachment is. You know, anxious attachment, you could say, is that So avoidant attachment, so let's start with avoidant, is a little easier. So avoidant attachment is that closeness is not safe. Anxious attachment is that distance is not safe. Okay, that's a way to think about it. And it makes sense that those all come from an injury basis, right? And maybe I should talk a little bit about attachment in general first. But the point is that it makes sense it oscillates in different stages of the relationship. And I don't think we can understand what's happening in ourselves in such a way that we can be compassionate and move forward and grow if we're so locked into these labels. Because if we identify with a label, if I say like I have an anxious attachment style, or I have a fearful attachment style, or avoidant attachment style, if you just fully anchor into these ideas, at a certain point, a prerequisite of you maintaining that label is being unwell. And it also, you risk losing an understanding of your suffering by healing or by realizing you're suffering in a different way. And so it can actually almost cultivate more suffering, if that makes sense. But to get into attachment real quick, this happens in infancy. And so a way to think about this is for a newborn infant, you know, we are very strange creatures, human beings, because when we come out of the oven, so to speak, we're not exactly cooked yet. There's a lot of vulnerability for a human infant, more so than other animals. And so because we're in this space of hyper vulnerability, and our nervous system is developing, and we are basically still in this form of development, which I guess that's a complicated notion because development goes for a very long time, but that still is technically true. The idea of love is too complicated. Like, love is a very complicated idea, but for an infant, I think a better word to describe what's happening is trying to understand what is safe, okay? So, you know, if an infant is put down in its crib and the parents leave, the infant may feel unsafe. And the reason they may feel unsafe is they're so vulnerable because they don't know if their parents are ever coming back. And if their parents don't come back, they die. Like, they can't take care of themselves. They can't feed themselves. They can't clean up after they defecate. Their very existence is threatened. And from their perspective, like, they don't know that you're gonna come back later, right? So what could happen is that when the infant is laid down and the parents leave, the infant experiences this feeling of not being safe and begins to cry, right? Now, obviously, makes sense. Now, what's really interesting is that you can have this dynamic where, you know, parents will be like, just let the baby cry it out and they'll soothe themselves, kind of sense idea, right? The dangerous thing about that, though, is that that kind of cultivates two things. Is that true? I don't know about that. What I could say is that that dynamic, though, is like, well, it's two things. One is that the baby learns, because for a lot of parents that are attempting this strategy, what they'll actually do is they'll just leave the kid alone, and the kid will cry and cry and cry, and they'll cry so much that the parents cave and then come and see the child. And in this instance, the child is learning that something must be wrong with me in order for me to experience safety, right? The other instance is that the parents just completely ignore the child's bids for safety, and the child now becomes starving for closeness or for safety. So the child is in a hyper anxious position, right? That when the parents do come back, they're like terrified they're going to leave again, right? Inverse example, infanticide, right? Am I saying that right? Infanticide, infanticide. A species that eats their own young. This is a biological phenomenon that's a lot more prevalent than we like to say, and it's something that it has existed in human evolution. And so, you know, that expression where, you know, this baby's so cute I could just eat it up, or pinching its cheeks, that's a very real threat to an infant, right? Again, the infant can't read your mind, doesn't know your intentions. And so if, you know, you are so close to that infant, you're holding it so close and you love it so much, and the infant is squirming, but you're still holding it tight, you're valuing your experience of closeness over that infant's experience. And what you're teaching that infant is that closeness is not safe, because this is too close and I'm nervous, right? And that can get into the nervous system, and all of a sudden closeness is viewed as unsafe. And then obviously there's a whole lot of complexity about how these ideas form and emerge. I think the important idea too is the plasticity of the brain, and that these are happening in development, which means that these ideas of what is safe is getting loaded, quite frankly, into the fight or flight response. That's why I use the word nervous system. And as the child progresses, it is important to know that just because an infant had a particular experience doesn't mean that you can't unlearn that. Life is really just fundamentally a project of unlearning. Probably more so than learning, actually, which is quite bizarre. But this is something that is adaptable, you know, and if somebody maybe was a very anxious baby that cried a lot and was, maybe the parents weren't, maybe the parents were just struggling and didn't had no idea what they were doing, which is every parent, right? That doesn't mean that child is doomed to insecure attachment. Right? Great childhood, or great teenage years, or great adulthood, or even just like taking responsibility for yourself as your own agency as an adult and changing your attachment style is definitely doable. But I think that's like a good template to kind of show how these ideas kind of emerge about anxious and avoidant attachment. Fearful attachment is something that is pretty horrendous that I don't even think I really want to talk about at the moment. It's not exactly relevant for the conversation. Yeah. So I think you can see this interplay between approaching an object of desire and attachment, right? Because the idea of safety, if you really think about love, the experience of love, it's very tied to safety, right? If you're in love with someone, you probably feel safe with them. If you really, really, really don't love someone, probably don't feel safe with them. Safety is very, very closely tied to this emotional experience of connecting, you know? And if you don't feel safe around somebody that you're supposed to, and I usually I hate that word supposed to, usually goes in quotations, but I feel like it's a pretty reasonable thing to say that you're supposed to feel safe around your parents. I think that's a pretty reasonable thing to say. And if you don't, whether it's physical, which is the fearful side of things, or emotional, the attachment side of things, well, they're both attachment, but like psychological maybe, or like love, right? Like if you just aren't really sure if your parents love you, that's going to be your nervous system's going to react to this. If you're not sure if your parents love you, your nervous system reacts in a way that
that situation is unsafe, because for us as human beings, if you were ostracized out of the tribe, if you were kicked out of the tribe, you die, right? Like that's a real dangerous thing. So you react in a way that's a threat to your physical safety, which makes total sense. If there was situations of abuse, makes total sense you react the same way. So your body reacts to a feeling of not being sure if you're loved, or if you are sure you're unloved, in a very similar way as compared to being threatened, because it is a threat. So if this is something that you've had the experience of just not really being sure where you stand, or not really being sure if you're loved, or not really sure if you're accepted, it makes sense that you're bringing that into the dynamic of when you're approaching things you desire, right? I think that makes complete sense. And I also think it's a completely fixable situation. And when I use the word fixable, I'm not saying fixable in the sense that there's something wrong happening, because there isn't. If you have an insecure attachment, there's nothing wrong with you. You're actually working perfectly well. If you think about it just psychologically, you're protecting yourself in a way that's extraordinarily reasonable. But it's reasonable on assumptions that are no longer accurate for the current situation. And so I think there's grace that's important to extend ourselves, in the sense that, oh, my body's reacting in a way that makes sense given the experiences I've had. And in this particular experience, that same danger isn't present, or potentially could be present, but also potentially couldn't be. I don't know, right? I can't assume. We kind of navigate the world based on default heuristics, right? Because the reality is like, if I'm encountering, let's say, a woman I find really attractive, my default heuristic may be that no woman likes me and every woman wants to reject me. Or my default heuristic could be that, you know, this is an excellent opportunity to build something, maybe. But I can't, both of those aren't true. But I can't know without talking to a person the actual nuance of the situation. I just can't know that. I have to talk to that person, I have to find out. And so it makes sense that we have these default programs that are based on incomplete information, because we have to. But I think there's tricks that we can do in our brains to develop a heuristic that's actually going to facilitate a feeling of confidence and security in oneself. And why that's important is this. If I have the heuristic that all women are going to reject me, and that especially a really attractive woman has so many options that she's going to look at me and think I'm inadequate in every possible way and wants nothing to do with me, that's going to affect, that is a thought that's happening in my brain, but that's also going to affect my emotional state. That emotion is going to affect my posture. It's going to affect my facial expressions. It's going to affect my mood. It's going to affect my sense of humor. It's going to affect even things like my pupil dilation. Like, it's going to affect so many things that is going to in of itself create a barrier that didn't need to be there. So hypothetically, if I'm having this experience in myself that I'm inadequate and I'm having this physiological response, if I end up having a conversation with this woman, it's going to be really, really hard to build a connection with this person, because I am preparing myself to protect myself from a person. And it's like, do you want to talk to someone, and do you feel comfortable with someone that's trying to protect themselves from you? Like, people, well, I shouldn't say all people, unfortunately. Most people aren't comfortable being predators. Most people are pretty decent humans, actually. I know that's a shocking thing to say, but I think it's true. Most people are cool. And most people don't feel like predators and aren't predators. And so if you're coming to me thinking I'm a predator and trying to protect yourself, I don't feel good about that. I
don't want to scare you. I just want to see you. But then now all of a sudden I have to treat you like a lesser person. Or, I think that's a really immature way of looking at it. I think I have to almost treat you like a good way to think about it is like a rescue dog that's been hurt their whole lives and is in the corner and learning the strategy of like making yourself open, receptive, and waiting for that dog to come to you, right? But that's something more for a therapist to do. That's not exactly just meet someone kind of thing. That's work, man, right? So it's just a dynamic that doesn't facilitate connection. Connection can only happen in the presence of safety. And when that safety isn't there, there has to be work to cultivate that safety. Instead, if you had a different heuristic, if I had a different heuristic in this example, and I thought, my heuristic is this. When I see a woman that I really deeply desire, my initial feeling is that I really want to talk to that woman, but I have no idea how to, right? That's a hell of a barrier to bridge. It's like, I want to have an awesome interaction. It's a beautiful person, but man, that's hard. I don't know how to do it. And if I feel that way, maybe that's how she feels too. Now, if that's my default conditioning is that every woman wants to have a fun interaction, desperately. But like every other human, they just don't know how to, because I may know how to talk to women in aggregate, or women may know how to talk to men in aggregate, but that doesn't mean they know how to talk to specifically you or specifically inverse. Like you can't know. You don't know a person. You just see him for the first time, right? So if I operate on this heuristic, that this is going to be such an awesome experience and I want an awesome experience, and she wants an awesome experience too, I'm not really sure how to get there, but like that desire is there. Well, that's going to facilitate excitement in me. And that's going to facilitate a different posture that I'm going to have. It's going to facilitate a different mood that I'm going to have, a different facial structure. I see me smiling already. It's going to change my gaze. I'm more likely to look someone in the eye than look down, right? So it's going to change a lot of things that are going to facilitate a feeling of safety, which then facilitates a feeling of connection, okay? And I think it's really important to not label either of these experiences as good or bad, because they're not. They're just experiences of priming yourself or preparing yourself for perceived expectations, whether that's danger or whether that's connection. And I think both are valid experiences. It's just one is a very painful way to live life. And for myself personally, I spent like a decade feeling that way. It sucks. It's not fun. It hurts. And I love myself more than that. I want to have a good life. I only get to do this life thing once. Wouldn't it be nice to not feel this all the time, right? So I think this, if you are in a situation where you feel this kind of anxiety in the presence of desire, and this isn't just necessarily in sexual desire in terms of connecting with a person in this sense, but this is also in the context of, for example, what I'm doing right now is I'm pursuing becoming a magician, right? I was a magician years ago, and I'm looking to do walk around magic as a career. I shouldn't say as a career. I'm just doing, my goal and vision is this. I want to get a job as a magician, do walk around magic, and that facilitates me enough free time that I can still be a full-time student. So it's a way to pay through school, and I'm really passionate about poker as well, and so I kind of would like to build enough money behind me that I could quit doing magic and play poker while I'm in school. So this is kind of the vision, right? But anyway, that's a scary thing because I very precisely figured out what I want to do and I desire it. And the putting yourself out there is frightening for all of these reasons that I've just laid out. And so how do we go from having this insecure attachment, this place of viewing connection as unsafe, of feeling rejected, of not knowing where we stand? How do we go from that to changing this heuristic, right? Well, the first thing is to understand that, for me anyway, and I think this is a universal, is that if you have an insecure attachment, what you do is you have a template of what love is. Love is not safe. Or it's not safe to fall in love, or whatever nomenclature you want to use.
And that template has occupied how you've navigated the world for God knows how many years. For me, it was like well over a decade, probably more. Actually, it's probably like 20 years for me. And if that's the way that I've occupied, actually, yeah, maybe a little longer, but whatever. If that's the way that I've occupied these interactions, you can almost think of it like a vortex, right? Like, or a whirlpool maybe. Like it's just this spinning thing. And there's a, and basically I'm taking this inertia and I'm attempting to reverse the flow of it to calm the water. That's a lot of force. Because if you think about inertia, right, it has its own momentum that carries it. And you have to fight against that to level it off, right? That's a very difficult thing to do. So I think the first step is to have compassion for ourselves and recognize the project that we're taking on is going to be extraordinarily challenging. And also, I think it's fair to say that those feelings of inadequacy are not pathologized. There's nothing wrong with this. That's why I'm very cautious with using that language fix. And I'm quite skeptical that somebody with secure attachment doesn't feel those things. Like everybody feels those things. But I think the difference is having that space where you can create a sense of calm in yourself and question those feelings. Are those really true? Or even better, act in spite of those feelings. Or to be able to notice, like, this is my natural proclivity, and that's okay, and it comes from all of these things that happened, and that's valid. But for right now, I'm gonna put that in this little box because those are real things that happen to, let's say, child Brad, and I can see myself in that. And I love child Brad, and I can take care of child Brad, but right now I'm adult Brad. And adult Brad doesn't have those experiences. Adult Brad's having this experience. And adult Brad's gonna have a fantastic experience, right? And so you can see all of those things and honor them and then continue to move forward. And so this idea of acceptance, I think, is really important for this experience of cultivating a secure attachment. And by the way, everything I'm talking to you about is something I'm working on right now. So I'm farthest thing from an expert in the sense that I like to think of myself as a secure attachment in training, right? But I think something that's helped for me is when I feel that insecurity happen, I do that project of seeing it, yes. But I also am working on thinking about the difference between nervous and anxiety. Because when you're really anxious, the physiological symptoms are identical to being excited, right? If I'm really anxious, my palms are sweating, my heart rate's going up, I may even be trembling inside. I may feel a sense of restlessness. All of those symptoms are identical to excitement. There's just a different framing, a psychological framing where we differentiate these two terms, but physiologically they're identical. And so that's the process for me, is like, oh, this feeling, this isn't anxiety, this is excitement. It's like, well, it's not true, I feel anxious right now. And it's like, yeah, because you had these experiences, fine, but this feeling you're having right now is identical to what excitement is. And so as we're adopting this new way of feeling and navigating the world, we're gonna have to reassociate these familiar feelings and re-anchor them. The other thing that I think is really important too is what I've been doing is really presencing myself and acknowledging this cycle of inadequacy and then anger, right? And when I say acknowledge, I'm not trying to change it, which is a paradox, and I'll get to that in a second. But when I say like, oh, I just saw something I really coveted or desired or wanted to be a part of, and I felt inadequate. And then I just hit the pause break. Been down this road a lot, man. I felt really small a lot of the time. And I see that. That's silly. Like, I kind of say it in my own head, like, I've been down this road a lot, and then that leads to anger, and then give me 5 minutes, and then I'll be sad again, and then I'll be angry, and then I do this dance, and I've done this dance a lot, and I know where it goes, and I know it very intimately and deeply, and I can see it for what it is. And the weird thing is, without trying to change it, just like acknowledging that it's something you've done so much that's kind of ridiculous, because there's nothing new there. I've done it for so much time that I have nothing new to learn about that experience of being inadequate and then angry and then inadequate and then angry. It's such a familiar habit that I know everywhere it goes. I know all the thoughts and all the feelings, and I know it. So I just look at it like, do I need to do this again? Right? Like, I just question. Like, I'm not even trying to stop it. I just question it. And I just think that's, you know, I just like, okay. I'm just noticing. And the weird thing is, in noticing it, in a non-judgmental way, the weird thing is the intensity just goes down. And my hope is that over time, this feeling of inadequacy and anger that comes from it, I'm quite confident the anger is just going to subside, because the anger is a response to the inadequacy. And I'm also quite confident the feelings of inadequacy will always be there, but they're just going to get quieter and quieter and quieter. And I'm going to be able to like have these little like tumultuous whirlpools in a body of water that are just going to become like little funnels now, and then they go away, right? I'm going to have all these waves and anomalies that come up, but I'm going to have an ability to experience those things and also smooth the water. Meditation's been really helpful in this regard, of being able to gain that space and just see these things and work on letting them go. And I gotta tell you too, like, I wanna be really honest, like, I struggle with this stuff. You know, I just had a date with a woman not too long ago, and all of these feelings I'm talking to you about were like right up front. And I like to think that I navigated as best as I could. But yeah, I'm still struggling, I'm still growing. And I like to think it didn't get the better hand of me, but it definitely was there. And it's present, and that's okay. And I'm gonna be really awkward and not really know what to say or what to do, and I'm gonna feel these feelings, yeah. But that's also an exciting moment for me, because now I'm in this place where I can go on lots of dates, and I can go through this experience of reshaping my attachment. Yeah, so that's the topic for today, about yeah, whatever it's about. I don't know. Take that what you will. Have a great day.